I'm Nora Bennett, 33 years old, and tonight I ran through an airport with a half-zipped suitcase because my mother said my grandfather was dying. I drove straight from the terminal to his house and left the rental idling in the driveway. My hands shook so hard I spilled insurance cards and pill lists all over the front steps. When the door opened, he stood there in his cardigan holding a coffee, the steam rising as if nothing in the world was wrong. I stared at him and felt my chest go hollow and bright. At the same time, somewhere between relief and disbelief, I said, "Grandpa," and he said, "Nora, what on earth is going on?" And before I could answer, the autumn wind lifted the papers and scattered them like small white birds across the porch. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to hold yourself together when family made you feel invisible. I grew up in a small Pennsylvania town where people knew who set out their trash on Tuesdays and who shoveled for the neighbor who couldn't. My grandfather taught me that a good name is earned one shift at a time, and my grandmother used to say, "We don't take shortcuts because they always cost more in the end." Those lessons stayed with me when I was bussing tables in high school, then waiting tables through college, then picking up weekend shifts in grad school while other students were at tailgates. I learned to balance ledgers the same way I learned to refill coffee promptly and without fuss. And when Whitman Haven Hotels had an opening in operations right after my MBA, I stepped in without asking for a title or making a speech. The brand wasn't flashy, just a string of boutique properties with worn smooth banisters and lobby chairs that made people linger, and I love them the way you love a house that's older than you are, by noticing what needs care and doing the work no one claps for. My parents moved easily in rooms I still felt I had to earn country club fundraisers, industry galas, the kind of dinners where your last name arrives 5 minutes before you do. My brother Dylan took to that world like he'd been born under brighter lights. He had an easy grin, a strong handshake, and no one asked him to prove much beyond showing up on time. When Grandpa talked business with me, he talked about occupancy patterns and frontline training and why the night audit tells the truth. When my parents talked business with me, it was usually to tell me to smile more in investor meetings or to soften the numbers so they sounded friendlier. Still, I kept my head down and my calendar full, taking red-eye flights to cover property inspections, stepping into staffing gaps without complaint, believing that consistency would speak for me when I didn't know how to speak for myself. 3 months ago, I was told I'd be leading the launch of our new Portland property, my first full-scale build-out, the kind of assignment you tuck your pride around like a good coat and carry carefully through every day. 2 weeks before opening, the plan changed in a single hallway conversation. "We need Dylan out front," my father said like it was weather he couldn't help. "He's got the personality for hospitality." I nodded because nodding had become my way of keeping peace. Then walked the back corridor and counted the steps to the service exit because the air felt thin and numbers still calmed me. I told myself it was temporary, a rebalancing, a chance to show I could support a launch from the operations side, but something in me felt quietly rearranged, like a picture frame set just a fraction off center you can't unsee. That night in Denver, I rehearsed my presentation to an investment board that barely knew my name, steadied by slides that tracked costs as cleanly as train tracks. The call came as I was laying out my dress for the morning. "Nora, it's Grandpa," my mother said, voice clipped at the edges. "We think he's had a stroke." The words rearranged the inside of my head. I booked the last flight home without thinking about the fee, forwarded my entire deck to our VP, and drove from the airport with my hazard lights blinking down a dark stretch of highway I could have driven with my eyes closed. When the door opened and Grandpa stood there, color in his face, coffee in his hand, my relief came with a second feeling I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't anger. Anger is loud. This was quieter, denser, like a door closing with a final click somewhere behind me. He led me in, and I tried my mother again. Waves in the background, laughter, the kind of music that follows sunshine. "I'm with Grandpa," I said and looked at him so he could hear it too. "He's fine." There was a pause, then a softened, "Oh," followed by something about mixed-up messages. Then the kind of gentle scolding I know by heart, how I get too focused on work, how I miss invitations, how family moves on without me because I make myself unavailable. I set the phone down and opened my social app with hands that had finally stopped shaking. A photo posted 2 hours earlier filled the screen. My parents and Dylan on a beach glasses lifted a blue strip of ocean behind them so bright it almost looked fake. The caption was a string of palm trees and sunglasses. The location tag read, Cabo San Lucas. Grandpa stared at the image the way you stare at a light that's hotter than you expected, a small lift of his chin, a tightening at the jaw that would look like nothing to anyone who hadn't known him for 33 years. "They told me you were tied up all week," he said. "They told me not to bother you." I gathered the scattered insurance cards and slid them back into the folder, each plastic edge catching on the paper like a small protest, and my breath finally evened out. In the foyer mirror, I looked like someone I recognized, and someone I didn't, and for a long second, all I could think was how many flights I'd taken to prove I could be counted on. The house smelled like old books and lemon oil, and a hint of coffee, steady and familiar, and it steadied me enough to say, "If they lied about this, what else have they been keeping from us?" Grandpa didn't answer right away. He walked toward his study, the long windows throwing rectangles of evening light across the rug, and rested his hand on the doorframe as if measuring how much to say and how fast. "Come sit with me," he said at last, the same words he used when I brought home math problems in 5th grade and budgets in my first job. I followed him into the room, where the first hotel contract still hung in a simple frame, its paper browned at the edges like bread left in the oven a minute too long. He reached for the drawer he keeps his reading glasses in and paused, looking at me in a way that made me feel taller and heavier at once. "Nora," he said, quiet and certain, "there are things you need to see." Grandpa motioned for me to sit at the desk across from him. The study felt both familiar and unfamiliar, like a place I had walked into 1,000 times before, but only now truly noticed. He slid open the bottom drawer and brought out a manila folder, thick with folded papers. His expression had shifted into something heavier than disappointment. It carried the weight of knowing too much for too long. I leaned forward as he opened the file. Inside were bank statements, trust documents, and minutes from board meetings that I had never been told about. Numbers and dates filled the pages in a way that was at once orderly and devastating. My eyes caught on a line showing over $1 million drained from an account with my name on it. My own trust, built from years of his savings and reinvestments, had been bled down almost to nothing. "That's your fund," Grandpa said, quietly tapping the page. "They've been using it for years." His voice didn't rise, but the words landed like a bell struck in a hollow room. I traced the entries: payments to a ski property in Colorado, monthly fees, to some club in Florida, consulting checks to Dylan that no record of work ever justified. My throat went dry as I realized how many choices in my life had been shaped by the idea that those resources were waiting for me when I needed them, when in truth, they had been disappearing under my feet. I turned another sheet and stopped cold at a notation for a 6-figure payment to a law firm I recognized. That was Dylan's accident. Grandpa explained, his face set hard. "A pedestrian was hit. Your parents used your trust to cover the settlement and make it disappear." My stomach tightened as I remembered that night how they had said Dylan was shaken up, but fine how I never pressed for details. The page in my hand told a story I had not been allowed to know. I looked back at Grandpa. His eyes, always sharp, even in old age, held mine steadily. "There's more," he said, pushing another file across the desk. It was a draft agreement that transferred the company entirely to Dylan upon Grandpa's death. My name wasn't mentioned once. The neat black ink confirmed what I had begun to suspect: my parents had never seen me as the heir, never intended me to share equally in what my grandfather built. My fingers shook as I reached for my phone. "I need to call Lauren," I whispered, already pulling up her number. My cousin had worked corporate law for years, and if there was anyone I trusted to read these papers for what they truly meant, it was her. Grandpa nodded slowly, almost as if he had been waiting for me to make that choice. Lauren answered on the 3rd ring, her voice alert even at that late hour. I spread the documents across the desk so she could see them through the video call. She leaned closer, eyes scanning the numbers and signatures as her lawyer's focus sharpened. These align exactly with board meetings where you were absent, she said, pointing to the dates visible through the screen. They sent you on inspections to clear the room before making these decisions. Her tone carried no doubt. Nora, this isn't favoritism. It's fraud. Grandpa's hand settled on my shoulder as I tried to keep my breathing steady. Lauren asked to see another folder, and when he opened it, her voice dropped. These are papers for a competency hearing, she said. Charles and Valerie were preparing to have you declared mentally unfit herald. They were going to remove your authority completely. The color drained from Grandpa's face. He gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles whitened. For a moment he looked smaller, the betrayal cutting deeper than any illness ever could. My father, his own son, had drawn up plans to silence him in his final years. Lauren continued, her voice steady and grim. There's evidence of tax evasion, offshore transfers, and backdated board minutes. They were moving to take everything from both of you. She looked directly into the camera. If they succeed, Nora, you lose your inheritance, your position, and your future here. The words pressed against my chest like a weight I could not set down. I thought of the long nights at properties in Portland and Boston, the quiet hours at airports when all I had for company was a laptop glow and my own belief that loyalty would be rewarded. The loyalty had been real, but the reward was already written out of the plan. Grandpa spoke softly, almost to himself. All my work, 50 years of labor, and this is how they would use it. His shoulders sagged under the truth of it. Lauren hesitated, then said, If you fight this, they'll cut all ties. You understand what that means. I let out a short breath that sounded more like a laugh. What ties? I said. They lied to me about you being on your deathbed just to keep me away. That's not family. The words sounded harsher than I intended, but they were true. Grandpa reached into the drawer again and pulled out another packet of papers. There's something else, he said. My health isn't perfect. The doctors call it early-stage heart trouble. Nothing fatal today, but it means I need someone I can trust. He slid the documents across the desk. These name you as my healthcare proxy and financial power of attorney if you'll take it. The pen felt heavy in my hand as I signed line after line. Each stroke of ink was more than a signature. It was a step away from years of waiting for permission to belong. The responsibility settled on me like a mantle, not just for myself, but for the man across the desk who had believed in me when others would not. When the last page was signed, the study fell into a hush, broken only by the steady tick of the old brass clock on the bookshelf. I closed the folder and sat back, my hands no longer trembling. For the first time in years, I felt something close to certainty. Grandpa leaned forward, his eyes steady despite the pain I knew he carried. They think they can cut us both out, he said, but we're going to fight back. I looked at him across the scattered documents, the quiet strength in his voice giving shape to a plan I had not dared imagine until that night. I didn't yet know what form it would take or how much it would cost me, but I knew one thing clearly. This was no longer about waiting to be chosen. It was about choosing myself. And as the clock struck the hour, I realized the first move would be mine. The ballroom of the Lexington Hotel sparkled with gold uplighting and polished silver trays. My parents stood near the stage with cameras flashing around them, their smiles fixed as they introduced Dylan as the new chief executive of Whitman Haven Hotels. His words were practiced smooth enough to impress the investors, sipping champagne in the front rows. I stayed near a potted fern at the edge of the room, watching guests drift past me as if I were a stranger. A former colleague stopped short when she noticed me. "Oh, I thought you had left the company," she said, her voice uncertain. I forced a steady smile. "Just restructuring my role," I answered, though the words landed flat even to my own ears. She wished me luck and walked away without waiting for a reply. By the time the fifth guest mistook me for someone on her way out, I slipped quietly through the service corridor and left the hotel. The next morning, an alert from my bank made my heart race. A family property in Sedona, which had been part of my grandfather's estate and promised to me, had been sold. The paperwork listed Dylan as the authorized signer. I called the family attorney, but my call went unanswered. When I tried the company's legal department, the receptionist placed me on hold only to return with a rehearsed explanation my access was suspended due to leadership transition. That afternoon, I saw Dylan on a regional business segment. He sat upright in a tailored suit, his expression calm as he said, "The company needed saving from years of mismanagement. Sometimes family loyalty requires difficult decisions." Each word stung, dismissing my years of late nights and unacknowledged work as if they had been mistakes to be corrected. Back at my apartment, I tried logging into my company email, only to find the password had been reset. When I called the IT department, they told me the change was authorized by new leadership. In the days that followed, I barely slept. I replayed old conversations in my head, searching for the warnings I had ignored. The place I had once considered a refuge now felt like a cell, every wall pressing closer the more I tried to think my way through. One morning during a board conference call, which I joined anonymously through a back channel, I heard myself referred to as the Bennett situation. The phrase cut deeper than any insult. I dropped my coffee mug, the shatter echoing in my small kitchen. Yet the call continued without pause, without my name, without me. I turned my dining table into a war room. Financial statements covered the surface. Stacks of company reports and legal references piled up on the chairs. I drew timelines on yellow pads, connecting dates of unexplained transfers to board meetings I had been deliberately sent away from. Slowly, the pattern of betrayal took shape, spreading across the page like a map of everything I had lost. Late one evening, a knock startled me. I opened the door to find Ruth, our longtime housekeeper, standing in the hallway. Her eyes darted past me before she pressed a small brass key into my hand. "Some things aren't right," she whispered. "Your grandfather always said silence makes us complicit. This opens your father's office." She slipped away before I could reply, leaving the key warm in my palm. 3 nights later, during a family dinner, I forced myself to attend for appearances. I waited until my mother was showing off their new kitchen renovation to guests. I stepped away and walked down the hall, the key cold in my hand. The lock turned smoothly, and I slipped into my father's study. The air smelled of polished wood and old smoke. Filing cabinets lined the wall, each drawer neatly labeled. I moved quickly, photographing every document that confirmed what we suspected: transfers bearing forged signatures, minutes backdated to justify suspicious votes amendments, to trust documents signed by witnesses I didn't recognize. My phone camera clicked steadily, capturing proof that could no longer be denied. The door opened behind me. My father stood in the doorway, his face dark with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice carried the same sharp edge it had when I was a child, caught coloring on his papers. I didn't stop. I raised my phone, showing him the dozens of images already captured. "Finding the truth you've hidden from me my whole life." He stepped closer, his presence filling the room, but for the first time I did not shrink back. He reached for my arm and I held the phone higher. "I already have everything I need." His expression faltered, a flash of fear breaking through his authority. For a brief second, the power between us shifted. "You've always underestimated me," I said, my voice steady. "That was your mistake." Later that night, I sat at Lauren's apartment while she spread the documents across her dining table. The space looked like a courtroom, and miniature papers stacked in careful order, a legal pad filled with her notes. She worked past midnight, drafting motions and mapping the next steps. When I offered to pay her for her time, she shook her head. "Consider it repayment for the way they treated my mother," she said. Grandpa arrived with a weathered leather portfolio, setting it gently on the table. Inside were the original company formation documents. "Your parents thought these burned in the office fire last year," he explained, his hand steady, despite the betrayal that had aged him in days. The phone rang, and it was Ruth again, her voice low. "Check the garden shed behind the pool house, under the boards in the floor. I've seen them hide papers there for years." Her loyalty was quiet, but unwavering, a reminder that truth sometimes comes from the places long ignored. Looking around Lauren's kitchen, I saw them all: my cousin with her lawyer's sharp mind, my grandfather with his lifetime of integrity, Ruth with her courage to speak. None of them stood beside me because of blood alone, but because they believed in what was right. We laid out a strategy together, connecting Grandpa's original contracts with the forged documents and financial trails. Lauren traced a finger over one clause that had been overlooked for decades. If fraud or unethical conduct is proven, ownership can be revoked. She looked up at me, eyes steady. "This clause may be your way in." I gathered the files into neat stacks, my phone filled with evidence, and felt the shift inside me. What had started as shock and helplessness was becoming something harder, clearer. I wasn't waiting for their permission anymore. The next step would be mine, and it would be seen. As I locked my front door later that night, the brass key still cold in my pocket, I knew the silence of the last few weeks was ending. The fight was about to move into the open. The key Ruth had pressed into my hand was still heavy in my pocket, days later a constant reminder of what lay waiting in the dark corners of my father's office. I didn't use it right away. Instead, I watched and listened, measuring every step as though the house itself might betray me if I moved too soon. When the opportunity finally came, it was during another family dinner at the estate when laughter carried from the dining room and my mother was busy leading neighbors through the newly renovated kitchen. The hall was quiet as I slipped away. The key turned cleanly in the lock and the door opened without resistance. The study smelled faintly of leather and the sharp tang of old smoke. Filing cabinets lined the wall, their drawers neat and precise, each one labeled in my father's careful handwriting. My heart beat steady but fast as I moved to the first drawer, sliding it open to reveal stacks of contracts and correspondence. I worked quickly, photographing page after page. Transfer authorizations with signatures I recognized but dates that didn't make sense. Board minutes rewritten with the ink already fading. Amendments to trust documents witnessed by names I had never heard before. Each image felt like a nail hammered into a box that had been years in the making, proof that could no longer be hidden. The click of the door froze me. My father stood in the doorway, his face hard as stone. "What are you doing in here?" His voice carried the same sharp tone he used when I was a child caught with crayons near his papers. I didn't flinch this time. I held the phone higher, the glow of captured images bright on the screen. "I already have everything I need." He stepped closer, his shoulders filling the room, but something in his expression slipped when he saw how steady I stood. "Get out!" he hissed, reaching for my arm. I pulled back, the words rising before I even thought them through. "You've underestimated me for the last time." His jaw tightened, but the look in his eyes wasn't authority anymore. It was fear. Later that night, Lauren's apartment turned into a command center. Documents covered every surface of her dining table, organized into neat stacks as she worked through the night. She wrote notes on yellow legal pads, her handwriting sharp and decisive. When I thanked her for giving up her time, she shook her head firmly. "This isn't about payment," she said. "Consider it repayment for how they treated my mother all those years." Grandpa arrived with a worn leather portfolio that he set carefully on the table. Inside were the original company formation documents, pages browned with age but intact. "They thought these were destroyed in the office fire," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed how much it hurt to know his son had tried to erase history. The phone rang, and Ruth's voice came through, low and sure. "Check the garden shed behind the pool house," she said, "under the floorboards. I've seen them hide papers there for years." Her words carried the weight of someone who had watched too much in silence and was finished pretending not to know. By the time the call ended, the kitchen table was covered with the beginnings of a case that told the truth of what my parents and brother had done. Fraud hidden in plain sight. Contracts reshaped to favor one name over another. Years of manipulation stacked neatly in black and white. I looked at the people around me, Lauren, with her legal mind sharp as a blade, Grandpa with his lifetime of principles, Ruth risking the only home she'd known, and realized none of them stood with me because of family obligation. They were here because of integrity. Lauren leaned over one of the older contracts, tracing her finger across a clause printed in careful script. "This," she said, "could change everything. It states that if fraud or unethical conduct is proven, ownership can be revoked." She looked up, her eyes steady on mine. "It's been overlooked for decades, but it's still enforceable." The words settled over me as solid as the files scattered across the table. For weeks I had been scrambling, trying to make sense of every betrayal, every door closed in my face. Now, for the first time, I had a path forward. Not just defense, but action. Grandpa sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "They've treated us both like we don't belong in our own house," he said. It's time we remind them who built it." His voice carried no bitterness, only resolve, and it steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. We packed the documents carefully, stacking them into folders, labeled and ready for the next step. The night outside Lauren's windows stretched quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. I tucked the brass key back into my pocket, knowing it had opened more than a door. It had opened the choice to stop waiting for change and start making it myself. As I left her apartment, the city lights blinking in the distance, I felt the shift deep in my chest. The fear that had followed me for months was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't holding me anymore. It was fueling me. The silence of being dismissed, erased, and overlooked was ending. The fight was about to step into the open, and I was ready to take the first swing. The days that followed felt like moving pieces into place on a board I hadn't known I was playing. Lauren's dining table became our headquarters. Every folder was labeled, every timeline sharpened, every document marked in neat handwriting. Grandpa came by each morning, leaning on his cane but steady in his voice, repeating the same phrase whenever doubt crept in. "Integrity doesn't need to shout. It just needs proof." One evening, Lauren placed a folder in front of me and tapped her pen against a line of text. "This clause," she said, "it allows ownership to be revoked if fraud or unethical conduct is proven." They never bothered to erase it. The words settled over me like a bell ringing clear in a crowded room. For years my parents had counted on silence, on shadows, on no one looking too closely. Now we had their own contract giving us a way back in. Ruth called the next night. Her voice was low, careful. "Nora, I've been thinking. I've seen more than just papers. There were visitors, men in suits I didn't recognize, slipping in late at night, leaving with boxes. I don't trust what they've been moving." She gave us details enough for Lauren to match with transfers hidden in the statements. Each piece narrowed the gap between suspicion and certainty. Lauren spread the files across the table until every inch of wood was covered. "This isn't just family betrayal," she said. "It's fraud that regulators would take seriously." Her words made the air in the room feel heavier, but they also steadied me. For weeks I had been holding fear like a weight pressing on my chest. Now I felt resolve filling the space where fear had been. The next step wasn't mine alone. Lauren called in a contact from the bureau, a quiet man who had already been investigating one of Dylan's so-called incidents. A pedestrian in Aspen, a payout that matched the numbers in our files. When Lauren hung up, she turned to me. "They're already interested. If we hand over what we've found, it won't just be a family fight. It will be federal." That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my apartment. The choice circled in my mind: confront them immediately, or let the evidence speak first. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't answer. The quiet hum of the city outside my window reminded me of all the times I had believed loyalty would be enough. This time, loyalty had to be to the truth. The morning we walked into Whitman Haven headquarters, I wore the same Navy suit I had worn to board presentations for years, the one no one ever seemed to notice. The receptionist froze when she saw me, but I didn't stop. 4 agents walked in behind me, their presence quiet but unmistakable. My heels clicked against the polished floor as I headed for the boardroom, each step marking the end of the silence I had carried for too long. Inside, the long mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lights. My parents sat near the center, Dylan on their right. The board members gathered with champagne glasses half raised. My mother's smile faltered, first her glass trembling in midair. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "What is the meaning of this?" I placed the leather portfolio on the table and began passing copies of the documents down the line. My hands didn't shake this time. "This evidence shows systematic fraud within the company." I said, my voice even. Page 3 details the diversion of $2 million from my trust. Page 7 shows company funds used to cover Dylan's accident in Aspen. The room was silent except for the rustle of papers. Patricia Morton, one of the senior board members, adjusted her glasses as she read, her eyes widening. My father barked, "These are forgeries," but I continued as though he hadn't spoken. The original contract written by Harold Whitman includes a clause on ethical conduct. It states that ownership can be revoked if fraud is proven. The CFO leaned back from the table, sliding his chair away from my father. Two other members closed their folders without a word, their expressions drawn. Dylan slammed his palm against the table, his voice sharp. "She's making this up because Dad chose me. She's jealous." One of the agents stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his badge visible in the light, "we already have documentation of the Aspen settlement, including proof the funds came from company accounts. Independent evidence supports these claims." Dylan's face drained of color. My mother pressed her hand flat against the tablecloth, her voice thin. "This is family business. It should be handled privately." The chairman cleared his throat, his tone grave. "Valerie, this is precisely why it cannot remain private. The board has a duty to the company." His eyes shifted toward Grandpa as the doors opened and he entered, leaning heavily on his cane. The room went quiet. Even hunched with age, he carried the kind of presence that reminded everyone why they were there. "I built this company on integrity," he said, his voice steady, "not deceit. If my family won't honor that, then someone else must." Beside him, Lauren stepped forward with the legal transfer documents. "Harold has signed over controlling shares to Nora Bennett," she said. "These are executed and binding as of this morning." The boardroom filled with murmurs. Margaret Alvarez entered behind them, her posture straight despite her years of service. My mother's face twisted when she saw her. "I've witnessed papers destroyed in the Bennett home," Ruth said calmly. "I kept a record of dates and descriptions. Charles told me to burn them." Her words carried the weight of someone who had nothing to gain and nothing to lose. The chairman looked around the table before speaking. "We'll take a vote." It didn't take long. Hands raised one after another until the tally was clear. My parents and Dylan were removed from all leadership positions, effective immediately. I stood at the head of the table, the same seat my father had filled minutes before. The weight of it settled on my shoulders not as a burden, but as something I was finally meant to carry. Across from me, my father's jaw tightened, but there was no ally left to meet his eyes. My mother pressed a trembling handkerchief against her face. Dylan stared at the papers in front of him, no words left to give. The chairman turned toward me. "Ms. Bennett, how would you like to proceed?" I gathered the files and closed the portfolio. "Tomorrow morning we'll hold a company-wide meeting. Every employee deserves to know their jobs are secure. Things are about to change here." As I left the boardroom, the agents followed close behind my grandfather's steps, steady beside mine. For the first time, I wasn't walking out of a room in silence. I was walking toward a fight that now belonged to me. The message came before dawn. My mother's number lit my phone with a single line. "We need to talk before this goes further. Dad's office, 7 a.m. I deleted it without replying, but when the clock struck 7, I was there. Not because they deserved the chance, but because I wanted to see their faces when the balance had shifted. The office felt smaller than it ever had. My father sat behind his desk, his posture rigid and forced. My mother's eyes were red tissues crumpled in her lap. Dylan stood by the window, pacing like a restless shadow. When I walked in, all three looked at me as if expecting someone they could still control. "Nora, please sit," my father said, his voice softened in a way that sounded practiced. "We want to explain." I remained standing. "I've heard enough explanations." My mother dabbed at her eyes. "You're overreacting. We've always had your best interests at heart." I leaned on the edge of the chair, steady in my voice. "You stole my inheritance. You tried to strip Grandpa of competency. That isn't protecting anyone but yourselves." My father spread his hands as though calming a crowd. "We can reach a compromise. We'll issue a public apology. You can share control of the Seattle properties. In return, you drop the more serious charges." My mother straightened her tone, hardening. "The scandal will destroy everything your grandfather built. Think about what you're doing." When that failed to move me, her eyes sharpened. "Your behavior shows you're unfit to lead. Perhaps we should revisit Harold's competency evaluation. He wasn't in his right mind when he gave you those shares." The old me would have flinched. Instead, I smiled and pulled a folder from my briefcase. "I've already met with our major investors. They support my leadership." I slid pages across the desk testimonials from hotel staff describing improved working conditions under my direction. Turns out people work harder when they're not terrified of losing their jobs. My father reached for the papers, but I drew them back. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to inform. You've undermined me for 33 years. That ends today." Dylan turned from the window, his voice sharp. "This is ridiculous. You can't—" I cut him off. "Your choices are simple. Face charges for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, or surrender your claims to the business and repay what you took. You have until 9 o'clock when the company meets to decide." I checked my watch, then walked out before they could answer. By the time employees filled the grand atrium, sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling. The air hummed with uncertainty, whispers rising and falling as the room filled. I took the stage, adjusting the microphone. "Thank you all for coming. I'm Nora Bennett, and as of yesterday I've assumed control of Whitman Haven Hotels following evidence of financial misconduct by prior management." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but I held my voice steady. "My first action as CEO is to announce a full restructuring. Effective immediately, profit sharing will be implemented for employees with more than 1 year of service." The murmurs turned into whispers of disbelief, then cautious applause. I paused, searching the crowd, until I found the familiar face of Ruth standing near the back. I also want to recognize someone whose integrity has guided this company more than anyone realized. "Ruth Alvarez, would you join me?" She hesitated, then stepped forward, her shoes clicking against the marble. "Ruth has worked in my family's household for decades. Today I'm naming her executive housekeeper across all properties with authority to implement fair wages for staff. She'll begin with a living wage for housekeeping teams company-wide." The applause grew, rolling across the atrium as Ruth reached the stage, tears glinting in her eyes. My mother's face twisted in shock, but I didn't look her way. "Finally," I said, "I'm establishing the Harold Whitman Scholarship Fund for the children of our employees. Education changed my life, and it should be within reach for every family here." At the back of the room, maintenance workers wheeled in a cart. They lifted down the oil portraits of my parents that had hung in the lobby for years and replaced them with a photograph of Grandpa and me laughing together at last Christmas. The sight drew another wave of applause, steady and sure, while my parents stood frozen near the side exit. Their badges had already been deactivated. By afternoon, the building hummed with whispers of the settlement. Word spread that my parents had signed surrendering claims and facing steep financial penalties with the threat of criminal charges if they broke the agreement. For the first time, the weight of their presence was gone. Later that day, my assistant knocked softly. "Your brother is here. He says he needs to speak with you." Dylan stepped into my office alone, no swagger, no smirk. He looked at me the way he hadn't since we were children, directly, without defiance. His voice was quiet. "I didn't know," he said, "about all of it. I swear." I set my pen aside and waited, listening to words that felt foreign coming from him. For the first time in months, I wondered if the story of betrayal had more than one ending. And as he stood there waiting for me to respond, I realized the next choice wouldn't just shape the company, it would shape what was left of family. The weeks after the atrium meeting changed everything. For the first time, employees stopped me in the hallways, not with hesitation, but with ideas, questions, and most of all, relief. The atmosphere in the hotels shifted like a curtain had been lifted. Guests noticed it too, smiles at the front desk that were no longer forced housekeeping staff laughing softly in break rooms. Change didn't come all at once, but every step forward reminded me of what had been stolen and what was finally being rebuilt. The profit-sharing plan went into effect that quarter. Numbers and spreadsheets began to reflect more than just revenue. They showed hope. Workers who had been silent for years spoke up in meetings with suggestions that actually made it into practice. Ruth took her new role with the same quiet determination she had carried in my family's household. Now her voice carried weight across every property. I still remember the first time she led a staff meeting. She stood at the front of the room, papers shaking slightly in her hands, but her words were firm. "You deserve to be seen. Starting today, you will be." The applause that followed was louder than anything I had ever heard in that space. The scholarship fund was announced in the company newsletter, and applications poured in almost immediately. I read through the first stack at my desk, the words of parents and children who wanted only the chance to learn without the weight of impossible debt. Each story reminded me of my own years working double shifts to keep moving forward. Approving those scholarships felt like setting down a stone I had carried alone for too long. Meanwhile, the settlement my parents had signed kept them out of the company, but their absence was felt in other ways. Former allies who had once hovered near them now came to me with cautious respect. Board members who had dismissed me began greeting me by name. It wasn't affection, it was recognition. And it was enough. Dylan lingered in the background for weeks after our conversation. He didn't press for forgiveness, but I saw his effort to distance himself from the lies. He sold the condo my parents had bought him, left the clubs they'd paid for, and started taking meetings of his own. The first time he showed me one of his plans, a small restaurant project in Seattle, I listened without interrupting. His voice trembled, but he spoke with a kind of honesty I hadn't heard from him since we were children. "I don't expect anything," he said. "I just want to start somewhere real." I nodded, and though I didn't give him an answer, I didn't walk away either. The months turned into a year. Whitman Haven's profits climbed 22%, but it wasn't the numbers that struck me most. It was the way people carried themselves in the halls, heads held higher, steps more certain. I was invited to industry conferences that had never called before. One evening at the annual Hotelier Gala, I stood in a green gown beneath chandeliers I'd once walked past unnoticed. When my name was announced as Hotelier of the Year, the applause thundered. I thought of the moment a year earlier when Dylan had been paraded onto a stage with my parents smiling on either side. The memory was still sharp, but the contrast made the weight of the Crystal Award in my hands feel even more solid. Success isn't about ownership, I told the room, my voice carrying more steadily than I expected. It's about building something that lasts, because it was built with integrity. I found Grandpa's face in the crowd, his eyes bright, and let the rest of my words flow for him as much as for the room. 2 weeks later, we gathered at Lauren's lakeside home. The evening was soft, the air carrying the smell of pine and warm bread. Ruth sat back in a chair, finally at ease in her retirement. Lauren poured wine with the confidence of someone who had seen her gamble pay off. Grandpa raised his glass and said simply, "To the family we choose." Lauren added, "To integrity restored." Ruth's voice was warm when she said, "To being seen." The candlelight flickered across their faces, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. The company was steady, the people who mattered were beside me, and the ones who had tried to break us were nowhere in sight. The next Monday, a cream envelope arrived at my desk. My assistant said it had come by courier, and when I opened it, I found a letter written in Dylan's careful script. He described the restaurant he had opened, one that hired people who needed second chances, men and women leaving prison, women leaving shelters, people who had been told no, so many times they had forgotten how to believe in yes. "I learned from watching you rebuild what they tried to destroy," he wrote. "Maybe someday we could talk again." I placed the letter beside the photograph of Grandpa standing in front of his first hotel. In that photo, he was only 25, holding the business plan he had written by hand. Next to it lay my own blueprint for the company's next Chapter 1, built around wellness centers for staff as much as for guests. The letter stayed on my desk all afternoon. I read it more than once, feeling both the ache of years of betrayal and the possibility of something new. The question lingered as the sun dipped lower through the office windows. Could family bonds ever be mended after being broken so completely, or was it enough to honor what had been good and leave the rest behind? The answer would not come quickly, but the choice at least was finally mine. The letter from Dylan stayed on my desk for days, the edges softening as I moved it from one stack of papers to another. I didn't answer it right away. Instead, I let it sit beside the photograph of Grandpa at 25, standing proudly in front of his very first hotel, his handwriting still visible on the business plan he carried in his hands. The two images, his young determination and my brother's quiet plea for a second chance, felt like bookends to a story I hadn't finished deciding how to tell. Work kept me busy, but not in the same frantic way it used to. Expansion plans for new properties filled my days, projects built not only for guests, but for the people who kept the doors open and the lights on. Wellness spaces, affordable childcare programs, and new training initiatives had begun taking shape. Each idea carried the mark of what we had endured, the belief that dignity should not be optional, that fairness should be as foundational as the walls of the hotels themselves. Grandpa watched the progress with quiet pride. At 77, he no longer walked the halls with the same quickness, but his presence remained steady. He often reminded me that he hadn't built Whitman Haven for profit alone, but for a name that meant something. Now, each new initiative felt like placing his values back into the mortar, sealing the cracks my parents had tried to pry open. Ruth adjusted to her new life with surprising ease. Retirement did not mean distance. She visited often, bringing baked bread wrapped in warm towels, her eyes lighting when she saw the scholarships being put to use. One afternoon, she leaned across my office desk, her hand covering mine. "It was never about the house," she said softly. "It was about being seen. And now we all are." Lauren remained my anchor in the legal storms that followed. There were still court appearances, still paperwork tying off loose ends, but she carried the weight without complaint. At family dinners by the lake, she laughed more easily now, her sharp edges softened by the knowledge that she had helped rewrite a story that once seemed fixed. And Dylan, his name still caught in my throat when I said it aloud. I visited his restaurant one quiet evening without announcing myself. The walls were painted a warm shade of cream, the tables worn but clean. Behind the counter, a young man with a faded tattoo wiped down surfaces with careful precision, his movements unhurried. Dylan stood at the pass-through calling out orders, his voice firm but encouraging. When he saw me, he froze, then managed a cautious smile. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted, wiping his hands on his apron. I looked around at the staff men and women who bore the marks of hard pasts, but carried themselves with pride. "You built something honest," I said. His shoulders dropped, relief visible in the way he exhaled. We didn't settle everything that night, but we stood side by side for a while, saying little, watching the place he had created run on more than his name. Back at headquarters, life found a rhythm. Employees greeted me with steady smiles, not out of obligation, but because the weight had lifted from the air. The scholarship fund grew, helping dozens of children start college. Profits climbed, but what mattered more were the handwritten notes left on my desk, a thank you from a housekeeper whose daughter could now study nursing, a letter from a maintenance worker who finally felt safe enough to speak in meetings. Each message reminded me that justice is not measured only in courtrooms or board votes. It is measured in everyday dignity, in the freedom to be seen and valued. One evening, Grandpa and I sat on the back porch of his house, the sun setting low over the fields. He leaned on his cane, his eyes watching the horizon. "You've done more than save a company," he said. "You've given it back its soul." His words stayed with me long after the light faded, a reminder that survival was never the only goal, it was restoration. Looking back, I realized the lesson was not about taking revenge or proving myself to those who never wanted to see me. It was about choosing integrity, even when it cost me about building something steadier than approval. Blood may have betrayed me, but chosen family. Grandpa, Lauren, Ruth, and the countless employees who stood with me proved that loyalty built on truth is the only kind that lasts. So when I see Dylan's letter on my desk, I don't feel the same bitterness that once lived in me. I feel the weight of choice, the choice to forgive carefully or to protect the boundaries I fought so hard to build. Either way, I know I will not lose myself again. Justice came not with applause or headlines, but with the quiet knowledge that fairness had been restored and that I had finally stepped into the place I was meant to stand. And now, as I close this chapter, I want to leave you with this: never let anyone convince you that your worth depends on their recognition. Build with integrity, protect your peace, and when the time comes, choose the family that chooses you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it stirred something in you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, I hope you'll stay with me for the next one.